when we find that there are elements of domination in the ideas of bhakti itself, naturally the rulers are going to use these ideas for political legitimacy and ideology. So we find that Shaivism became very popular with the Cholas. All right. And the reason it also became very popular with the Cholas is because Shaivism had a greater scope of including various, smaller cults and religious communities into its ambit. This is primarily because the iconography of Shiva was not fixed, it was formless. The linga is actually an aniconic symbol, it does not have a shape. So it's easy to accommodate many, small religious cults into Shaivism, which is not the case with Vaishnavism, where the demeanor of Vishnu, where the the outer look appearance of Vishnu is very fixed and in many ways also very elitist. He's dressed up like a king, whereas Shiva is not dressed up like a king. So Shaivism became actually the royal cult of the Cholas during this period, and they constructed temples in those places which were sung to popularity by the bhakti hymnists, the Nayanmars. So you have sacred geography coinciding with political geography during this period. That is, wherever the Alvars and the Nayanmars had sang about the god existing there, in those places temples started being constructed by the Cholas themselves. Of course, the Chola rulers also constructed Shaiva temples in places which were not sung by Arvars and Nayanmars. These were, typically political in nature. For example, in Tanjavur, Gangai Konda Cholapuram, these were all political temples. These were not sacred temples. They were not sung by the, Nayanmars at all. Now, hence, we find that Shaivism was successful due to its tactful presentation of an integrative paradigm, where it could integrate the Tamil Bhakti, the Brahminical forms, and also the local cult. So we find that this kind of a royal patronage helped Shaivism and the Shaiva community to grow up in this period. We have the Shaiva Agamas being codified during this period. And Shaiva Agamas actually talk about how to worship Shiva and how to construct Shiva temples in this period. We also find that the temples, the Shaiva temples became extremely important and very, very popular. Iconic, there were various important iconic forms of Shiva which came up, and we find that in this particular period, the Shaiva scriptures were also written for the first time. Uh, the Shaiva hagiography, Periya Puranam, was also written, on the court of Raja Raja I and Kulothunga II in this particularly in this period. In fact, the narratives which were there in the hagiographies, they inspired the themes of the Chola temple. So we have, the royal patronage as well as the development of the religion and development of the community happening together. Because, Shaivism was far more integrative, it had far more direct, symbols of warfare and politics. The Cholas could adopt it easily and they patronized it, and that patronage led to the popularity of Shaivism. It led to the writing of their scriptures and agamas and their hagiography, Periya Puranam, during this period. Now, this kind of a heavy royal patronage to Shaivism marginalized the development of Vaishnavism. All right. So very often, we are shown in our texts that Sri Vaishnavas or the Vaishnavas have become the target of royal persecution. In fact, the story of Ramanuja, whom I have recited before, he is considered to have been targeted by the Chola ruler because he refused to say that Shiva is the superior god. It is recorded in the hagiography. What is the truth of the story, we don't know, but I think it's also incorrect to ask whether stories are true or false. The question that we should be asking is that why did these stories become so important? Why did these legends become very important? They're so important that one of the films of Kamal Hassan called Dashavatara, the first scene is that of a Vaishnava priest. Here he was not shown as Ramanuja, who is persecuted by the Chola ruler, tied to the Sheshnag. Sheshnag is the snake, the serpent throne of Vishnu. He's tied to the stone serpent throne of Vishnu, which is made of stone, and he is thrown into the sea. All right. So, and this is a very, very popular story in the Vaishnava hagiographies, which were written from 13th century onwards. And these stories or these legends are a matter of great fame, and they're popular till date. So one of the reasons when one can talk of the fact that persecution became such a persistent theme in the Vaishnava hagiography is because probably they were not actually persecuted, but they were not given importance to by the Chola rulers themselves, who were actually promoting Shaivism during this period. So unlike the Shaivas, the Vaishnavas were not a very well developed organized community now. All right, attempts were made to sort of try and organize themselves with the writing of the Bhagavad Puran. The Bhagavad Puran is actually composed in the southern region, but we find that it wasn't very, very successful. So it is only after the 10th century AD that we find Vaishnavism, along with Shaivism, started receiving a little bit of royal patronage from the Cholas. All right, and the Vishnu temples started being expanded upon during this period. Now we find that this kind of encouragement to Vaishnavism, the royal patronage to Vaishnavism, we find that still did not actually help Vaishnavism to develop. This is primarily also because of certain intrinsic limitations of Vaishnavism itself. It did not have that kind of an integrative capacity that could become the basis of political ideology and social philosophy of egalitarianism. As a result, we don't have a social base of Sri Vaishnavism. Plus, Vaishnavism also had poor networks of interaction. All right. So consequently, they were all separate during this period. Now, in the 8th, 9th century, you have another very, very important philosophy coming in, which is that of Advaita, or the non-dualism of Shankaracharya, which starts influencing, a large number of intellectuals during this period. So, on one hand, you have these popular religions existing. On the other hand, you have the intellectualism spurred by Shankaracharya emerging during this period. All right. Now, it was a very clear, the audience of Shankaracharya's, Advaita was the intellectual elite. Now, by the 11th century, we find something dramatic happening. We find that this intellectual Brahmana elite tries to develop a community in a strong way and starts integrating, the popular religion in order to form a community. All right. So the Tamil Bhakti of the Shaivas and the Vaishnavas particularly started getting fused with the Brahminical intellectualism encouraged by Shankara's Advaitism, or against Advaitism, either of the two, because Shankara was also criticized. They started coming together. All right. And the reason why they also started coming together is also because this is a period of immense social change. You have new social classes coming up as political groups, and the intellectual elites as well as popular religion, they are constantly looking into this new social class for patronage. All right. So they start coming together, and we find that idea of, a philosophy becomes very important. A theology becomes very important. And it is in this context that the role of Ramanuja becomes very important for Vaishnavism, because he gave a concrete philosophy of Vishishtadvaita, which actually bound the community together. That is why you will find that, you'll find that this need to bring in the popular Tamil religion along with the philosophy becomes very crucial. So, for example, in the case of Vaishnavism, you have the intellectual philosophy of Ramanuja, Vishishta Advaita, coming together with the hymns of the Alvars. So naturally, the hagiographers who are mostly Brahmins, that is, the ones who are going to write about these saints, about these Alvars, are going to write in a manner which will impress people. So the legends would be such that they have a long life, they have a greater impact, they create faith, and they cannot be questioned. All right. This is not to say that everything was constructed. No, it is not constructed. A tradition is getting invented, there is doubt. But it is not complete construction, because both the Nayanmars and the Alvars, in their hymns, not all of them, but most of them, in their hymns have signature verses where they talk about themselves, where they say we belong to this community, that community. Even in their own hymns, they say, I am a pariah, who will help me? Lord, I am coming to you. The thing, so you can make out, you can make out their social background, etc. So it is in this context that the social background of the Alvars start becoming important. Then, with the rise of the Hoysalas and with the rise of Vijayanagar, when more and more social groups start coming in, newer social groups, warrior communities start coming in, it becomes very, very incumbent on both the Shaiva and the Vaishnava community to show themselves as egalitarian, to show themselves as liberal and of a broader outlook. One of the ways in which they show themselves as liberal and as of a broader outlook is, of course, to sort of, by projecting deliberately the low caste backgrounds of the Nayanars and the Alvars. So the low caste background is there, but they are projecting it more, all right, during this period. Though the people who are composing these books, these texts, are Brahmins themselves. We must remember that. But the emphasis is to, of course, project the low caste background of the Alvars and the Nayanmars, and project and also bring in the other popular traditions into Vaishnavism and Shaivism. For example, in Shaivism, the Siddha tradition was incorporated. And the Tamil Siddhas became a very important part of the, of Shaivism. The profile of the Siddha saint, Tirumular, became very, very crucial in the Shaiva Siddhanta movement. So this inclusion of anti-Brahminical and unorthodox elements into the traditional Shaiva order, all right, inspired the Shaiva movement of the 14th century, which was called the Shaiva Siddhanta movement. All right. So the Tevaram acquired, a sacred status, and the Shaiva Siddhanta philosophy, became very, very important. Now, another way in which, we find that both the communities were actually, sort of projecting a popular face was also by writing huge commentaries on the hymns of the Alvars and the Nayanars themselves. So you see, there were interpretations, counter interpretations during this period. With the result, there would obviously be, tensions and conflicting interpretations too. Even those also started happening. While the temples were developing in this very, very crucial way, because of interpretations, counter interpretations, the rise of different kinds of social groups, even amongst the Brahmins themselves, we have the development of the monasteries or the mathas themselves. The mathas or the monasteries become very important. We very rarely talk of Hindu, if I have to use the word, or let us say we very rarely talk in the history of medieval India of Brahminical monasticism. Our focus on monasteries and monasticism is mostly on the Jains and the Buddhists in the ancient period. Now there is some work on the on the Gorakhnath, but not too much. But by and large, for us, the idea of asceticism and monasticism in the Brahminical tradition in the medieval period, because that is where it develops actually, not in the ancient period. Even the Gorakhnath Mutt and the Kapalika Mutts, they are a major development of the medieval period. We very rarely they find any kind of a research interest. Most of the time we are actually so obsessed with Bhakti and Sufi, which are there. One is not denying their relevance. They should be studied. But the history of religion in medieval India and early modern India is also beyond Bhakti and Sufi. There are far other traditions and other, developments which we also need to study. And monasteries or let us say the mathas are one such institutional tradition which have got by and large ignored. All right. So the Shaiva monastic, organizations as well as the Vaishnava monastic organizations became extremely important. All right. Because here the Jiyars are the head of the mathas. They would go from village to village, talking to people, making devotees and expanding the social base of the religion. All right. So we find, and at the same time, they would also be visiting the rulers and the ruling groups, and of course, taking, patronage from them. So we find that the Smarta Mathas, the Vaishnava Mathas, as well as the Shaiva Mathas, which came up during this period, actually, became major power groups for resource control for the royalty, particularly the Vijayanagar royalty. So we find that the Mathas became traders, they became agriculturists, they had huge land with them, and they basically also became the custodian of the religious canon. A large number of stories of Nayanmars and Alwars that we read in the hagiographies were all written by the people in the Mathas. The Mathas commissioned them, that, okay, now you write, about us. Now we find that while, this kind of a development is happening, when we come to the 14th century, there is a very major development which is recorded, and that is that of the Turkish invasion. All right. Now, the Bhakti, what happens to Bhakti then? What happens to the Bhakti cults during this period? We find that when we look at the hagiographies, they seem to be talking about interactions of their saints of the 12th, of the medieval period with the Turkic rulers. Interestingly, the religion is not discussed of the Turkic rulers, but it is said they destroyed temples, meat eating became, popular in the temples, so on and so forth. You must remember that these stories became, or recordings of this interaction became very common in the 14th and the 15th century. I think we all know when Alauddin Khalji came, followed by Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and of course the decline of the Madurai Sultanate. Please remember that 14th century is also the time when Vijayanagar and Bahamini are also being established. All right, there is an interface of these rulers with the Delhi Sultans. So it is bound to be, it is, so how can the religious texts not take this into account? Now, clearly, warfare against the Turks was an important, point, not only for the Vijayanagar rulers themselves, but also for the Vaishnava and the Shaiva communities also. Because if I want patronage from my ruler, your enemy is my enemy, your friend is my friend. That kind of a concept is seen. So we find that in these hagiographies, the invasions of the temples are described, the looting of the temples are described. Let us take an example of the case of Ramanuja, whom I have mentioned. We find that in the case of Ramanuja, he's supposed to have recovered an idol which was looted by the Delhi Sultan, whose name is not mentioned in the hagiographies. It is looted by the Delhi Sultan. He goes and recovers it, from Delhi, by negotiating with the Sultan, who's very impressed with Ramanuja, and it is the idol becomes a important plaything, a doll kind of a thing for the Sultan's daughter. So when he's bringing the idol back to Delhi, to southern India, and different places have this story. Srirangam has this story, Melkote has this story, Tirupati has this story. So, Ramanuja in different hagiographies is either bringing it to Karnataka or to Tirupati or to Tamil region. All right. There is no consistency about this. So when he's bringing it, the Sultan's daughter, who's fallen in love with this idol, cannot stay without the idol, runs after that idol, and when the idol is installed in the temple, she merges with it. Now this is the story, or this is the narrative in the hagiography. Now look at this very interestingly. Ramanuja's period is actually 11th to the 12th century. He died in 1137 AD. Now clearly the invasion of Alauddin Khalji as well as Muhammad bin Tughlaq was definitely after 1137 AD. We know that very well. All right. So under no circumstances would Ramanuja have encountered the Turks. All right. So obviously this is something which has been inserted in the texts. But are we going to just brush it aside like this? I don't think so, because why is this being written? Do the hagiographers, don't they know that what they are writing is anachronistic? The dates don't match. They do know that. They do know that Ramanuja preceded the Turks. But hidden in this story are certain symbolisms. There is a symbolism of devotion. There is a symbolism of bhakti. And the symbolism of devotion is shown in the case of Ramanuja, who is braving all kinds of hardships and recovers the idol. The symbolism of bhakti, surrender to God, is shown in Sultan's daughter when she merges with the idol. All right. So for the hagiographers, to bring the community together, to address the community, it is this idea of bhakti which is very important. All right. Not the fact that the events may not match, they may be ahistorical, so on and so forth. All right. So what I'm trying to tell you is that in this particular period, during the Vijayanagar period, both the Shaiva and the Vaishnava communities are using all kinds of reserves of narratives to portray their community as broad-based, as liberal and devoted, and full of the ideas of bhakti, true to the ideas of Nayanmars and the Armars. All right. So this is how they receive the history and they decide to shape it during this period. Now, as you know, both the Shaiva and the Vaishnava faiths, they develop a large following. We also find that, and with so many power groups with them, we also find a large number of pressure groups that also start developing within them. And hence, in many ways, in the case of Vaishnavas, it led to a split, all right, of the community into two sects, which I spoke about, which is the Vadagalais and the Tengalais. I spoke in the beginning, all right. The pressures also, or the internal contradictions were also there because of the way they interpreted the hymns of the Arvars, the idea of bhakti, so on and so forth. All right. Also, the interpretations and the way they portrayed the life stories of the Alvars and their saints also became points of departure for them. So we find that what began as an idea of protest, that is bhakti, helped in the community development, but it also had in itself, ideas of dominance and hegemony. It also had in itself the ideas of creating very strong community consciousness, sectarianism, and also contradictions. And it is this story that becomes very important for us. So, what happens is that in the 20th century, because we look to history for inspiration and glory, both, we are not able to often understand, the fact that protest is also very complex. Protest is not linear at all, as we like to believe. So I come to the last part of my lecture where I had begun with that particular story of Ramanuja. That story is so popular that in the modern books today, Ramanuja is called the Periyar, the Periyar of the medieval period, the Ambedkar of the medieval period, and so on. So he's, the modern biographies of Ramanuja identify him as a social reformer. In fact, he is supposed to be someone who radicalized the whole system. Now, as students of history, as what we say, we are not into popular history. When we get into universities and colleges, we look at history as an academic discipline, which makes it a bit boring, which doesn't bring it, which sometimes brings us in contradiction with the popular perception of history. So we cannot make popular perception of history as academic history. So academic history has its own methods of analysis. So when we look at this professional history, if I have to use the word, we find that, sources are our only way in which we can understand this. When we are talking of this particular story of Ramanuja, we find that when we take 10 hagiographies of Ramanuja, from 13th century to 18th century, all 10 don't talk about this story. Maybe 3 to 4 of them talk about this story. So, but the perception is universal. If today I go out and say that no, Ramanuja, the story is, not, it's not fitting, but people don't believe it. The cult of Ramanuja has inspired protest and dissent for generations, to the extent that the Ramanandis take their inspiration from Ramanuja. So that is the image of Ramanuja which has got created in the hagiographies. He never wrote his own biography, so we don't even know what he was saying. What he, unlike the Alvars who write their signature verses and tell about themselves, Ramanuja did not even do that. So we are actually relying completely on the hagiographies. So very often the versions of the medieval saints that we have today, including Kabir, is not what they said about themselves. It is what the others said about them. All right. And the others are people who belong to that community, who have received the tradition, who have decided to shape that tradition in a particular fashion. And hence, in the 20th century, we are obsessed with the idea of social reform, obsessed with the idea of, protest and dissent. And we, of course, take it as a literal, a hand-me-down tradition from the past. History doesn't give us clear answers. History is full of ambiguities. All right. We can never get a clear answer. Whether Ramanuja was, against caste or not, his own writings do not tell us. But the image about him, which the hagiographers have written, tell us that he was against, or he was against the domination of the Brahmins in the temples. He is supposed to have instituted reforms where the Shudras were allowed to enter the temple, where the hunters were allowed to enter the temple. But we do not have him saying anything. The inscriptions of this period of 14th, 15th century, when these texts are being written, actually show a lot of patronage from the shepherd community, from the hunting community of the temples themselves. All right. So we don't know what it is. Was it actually Ramanuja, or was it because these groups were patronizing the temples that the hagiographers decided to include them in the texts? We don't know. We have to leave it at that. It baffles us, it makes us uneasy, but there would never be any definite answers. So I stop here today. Thank you very much. Yeah.